Hey, Dr. Simmons here. Just finished going over your midterms and been looking at the video that you did with your points. Thank you for the hard work. Thanks for the diligence on that. I think some of us are still struggling with how do you come up with a sermon. So I thought I'd take the next few minutes and sort of go over that. The first thing is, where do you find a scripture? How do you know what to preach on? Well, unless God sends you a telegram every day, you've got to go out there and just be open to His leading. It may be as you're reading through the scriptures. And if you're not doing a daily devotional or daily Bible study, I'd encourage you to do that. Let God speak to you. It may be through a book you read. It may be through someone that you heard. It may have been by listening to somebody else's sermon. It may have been by going to a Bible study. I don't know where all you get your inspiration from, but I know God is always speaking to us. Our goal is to always be listening. And you'll be surprised at how God speaks to you about themes, scriptures, ideas. He will speak to you. I promise you. I promise you that He does. That's probably the hardest part, is figuring out where we're going to get a scripture from. And so just work at that. Now, if you're doing a topical, maybe you will have a topic that just strikes your fancy, or maybe it's something that you feel God has led you to as you're thinking about things, or maybe as you're speaking to people in the congregation, you hear or feel a sense or a need of a certain topic. In that case, you look for the topic and then you try to find 3 or 4 scriptures that will support that. Don't just pull them out of the air. Be faithful to that. Anyway, once you have your scripture, the next thing is to dig deep into that scripture. Here's what I tell students all the time, and I think I've mentioned this before. I'll mention it again. Dig and dig and dig as deep as we can until we look down in that hole that we're digging and we see a mirror and we see ourselves. Dig until the scripture speaks to us. And if you're the pastor or you're going to be preaching, dig until that scripture speaks directly to you. So we dig until the scripture speaks to us. We have that moment where we say, wow, it's speaking about me. This scripture is speaking about me. Then and only then do we move on. Because we want to make sure that the scripture is speaking to us before we try to get it to speak to other people. So once we look into that deep hole and we see that mirror and we see ourselves in there, keep digging. Keep digging until you find that mirror. Keep digging until we find ourselves. Keep digging until we know the scripture speaks to us. Then, and only then, are we ready to move on. Now, every sermon should have one point. And every scripture should have one point that we focus on. It may have, the scriptures may have 4 or 5 points, 6 or 7 points, but find one point, just one point, that speaks clearly and directly to you. Then once you find that scripture point, then start focusing on that single point. Now, I'm thinking about the scripture, that it was on my mind, I just lost it, where Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And the disciples were absolutely astonished and perplexed at the humility that Jesus portrayed as He washed the disciples' feet. So, the essence of the scripture in a sentence would be, the disciples were astonished at Jesus' humility when He washed their feet. It's in the past tense. So the first question you ask is, what? What is the scripture about? And I say it's sort of like carpentry. You find one nail and you start to get that nail across. You drive that one nail home. Now the first part is the what, and we come up with the essence of the scripture in a sentence. One sentence, one point. You don't say, don't dig 4 or 5 points up, just one. Make sure that point speaks clearly to us. The second thing is, then we come up with the essence of the sermon in a sentence. Now, The sermon is the so what. The what is the scripture. The sermon is the so what. So what does it mean? So what does it say? This is where we take the truth in the scripture and we apply it to our lives today. Again, we have to find that point to where the scripture is speaking to us, and then and only then can we move on and start applying it as to how it works for us and how it works for others there. So as we get there, so if we're going to follow that same theme, then the essence of the sermon would be a so what. And that so what in this case would be, just as the disciples were astonished at Jesus' humility, so we too should be astonished at the humility of Jesus. You see how I put that in the present tense? It's called an hermeneutical arch. We go from the past tense to the present tense. We go from the what to the so what. Now, if we're going to come up with the questions, and we can go a world of places from there, but your question and your introduction should have at least 3 points, probably no more than 4, in which we are going to nail that 1 point down. We're going to hit it, we're going to target it, and every point in our points is going to point to, there's a lot of points in there, is going to go to that nail that we're hammering in. Now, what we do is, how do we get to the points? Well, we have an interrogative, which is who, what, where, why, how, and then we have an introduction that leads us. The introduction is something, here's what, let's just do this. There are many different ways we can look at that and how we get there. Let's just choose this. Let's look at the different, the order or the logical way that this transpired. So let's first look at, we'll say the progression of how this happened. The disciples saw Jesus' humility, then they looked at themselves and realized how unworthy they were, and then they realized how they needed to follow the example of Jesus. So let's just say this. Okay, so we're going to see what are 3 steps that the disciples found that led them to be closer to Jesus. What are 3 steps that the disciples followed that led them to be closer to Jesus? That's still part of the what. And then, so we will say that will be the question. So then we'll say, let's look at these 3 ways or steps that the disciples followed and see how they can help us to be more tuned to the will of Christ. And then we start dealing with them. The first step was recognizing that Jesus had selflessly performed an act of total humility. He humbled himself before the disciples and washed their feet, something only a servant can do. This points to the servanthood of Jesus Christ. Second thing. The second step is the disciples instantly recognized how unworthy they were. So when Jesus was performing this act of humility, of servanthood, they realized how unworthy they were because they kept saying, no, don't do this, don't do this. But he kept on. The third step is they recognized that they needed to follow the example of Jesus. And then we can put that in the modern day and so say something to the fact that just as the disciples recognized the need to model the servanthood of Jesus, you and I need to do the same thing. Now, this is just a real brief overview. Now, the conclusion. The conclusion is that aha moment when we bring all of that together. So the conclusion would be something like this. The disciples recognized the humility of Jesus. They recognized that in the undeserved love they were receiving. And then they realized they needed to follow Jesus. You and I, all of us, need to do the same thing. We need to recognize that Jesus Christ loved us, gave his life on the cross for us. We also recognize this, we didn't deserve that. We are undeserving. But because he did, he set the example for us to go out and reach the world the way he did. Would you join me today as we commit ourselves afresh and anew to Jesus Christ, that we would go out and make the world a different place because we're following the example of Jesus Christ? Now that's how we conclude it. The conclusion is the aha moment when we recognize what happened and then we challenge people to do something. Every sermon should challenge people to do something, not just think about it, not just be an intellectual exercise. It should be an act that calls people to service, to duty, to responsibility. Now, the title is the last thing you'll come up with. Get a title that is short, catchy, and after you thought about the whole thing, then come up with a title that you think is going to catch people's attention and do that. Okay, I hope this has helped you to see a little bit out of the progression of how we do this. Anyway, we'll be dealing with some more, but I think some of us are really struggling with how we do that, how we make that happen. I hope this helps. I hope you took some notes. Hope you'll watch it again and maybe take some notes and send me a message if you need have some more questions about it. All right, hope it helps.